And so in this section, diagnostic exposure levels to patients, our goal here is to learn what the exams are actually giving to the patient, like how much, what is the absorbed dose per exam, so you get a feel for that. We've talked about things today that, such as, acute levels of radiation, upwards of 1 gray or more, right? And I said that, diagnostic x-rays do not give people anywhere near those numbers, okay? So we need to look at what those numbers are. First off, a couple of disclaimers before getting into looking at the tables. These tables, which are going to have the actual exposure levels in them. So let me define and clear up some things. Ask questions if you have them. So this first statement is to say that distributed skin exposure is not the exposure delivered to any particular section of tissue, because it may be spread out by different projections to different portions of the skin. Basically what they're saying here is that if they tell you, for example, let's jump to the table real quick here, okay? And let's look at, right at the top, one view PA chest x-ray, right at the top. It's said to give an exposure of 200, and that little symbol means micro, next to the GY, microgray. So there are prefixes like milli, which mean 1/1000th of something. So 1 milligray is a 1,000th of a gray. Then there's a prefix of micro with this little Greek symbol. Micro means 1/1,000,000th. So this is 200 parts in a million of a gray. Okay, 200 millionths of 1 gray, microgray. So that's the exposure level for a 1-view PA chest. But look at, for example, a 2-view chest x-ray is said to give a patient 1 milligray, so 1/1000th of a gray, okay? A 2-view chest requires 2 chest x-rays, right? A front view, roughly speaking, and a side view, okay? Those 2 images, the total exposure, you had to expose them twice in different positions. So we're going to say that over those 2 images, the entire distributed skin exposure is 1 milligray, okay? But the single view chest x-ray might the first one, the front view, might only have accounted for 200 microgray of that. The rest of the exposure came from the side view, okay? So each exposure is not equal, right? Certain exposures and positions are going to expose the patients to way more for the same body part, way more radiation for the same body part than a different position would do for the same body part. Okay, so position matters. So distributed skin exposure, they're saying here, is that the number they're giving you, any of these numbers, you look down the third one down, 2-view knee, 1.5 milligray, that required different positions. So that 1.5 milligray is not the exposure for one image, it's the exposure for the entire exam. And that exposure is distributed over several different images and in several different positions. So different body tissues are getting more or less irradiated. Okay, so that's their first statement.
I have a question, Alex.
Yeah.
So I noticed that on here it says that the 5-view C-spine has less than an L-spine. Is it because it requires like more Kvp and mass?
It's going to be due to source to image distance and mass, yeah, MAS, mass, quantity of x-rays, yeah. Yeah.
And then, so philosophically, so when doctors prescribe an x-ray, they say, I want an x-ray.
Yeah.
Do they operate on the same line of protecting the patient? Do they understand and know, hey, we're exposing our patient to a lot of gamma?
I would say that X-ray, right? So I would say that most physicians don't have a rigorous quantitative understanding of exactly how much the exposure is per exam. They know things like the exposures are low and they don't cause any short-term effects, and they know there is a long-term risk with each exam. That's basically the level that the physician's likely to have. Know that there is a risk, know that there is a low amount of exposure, but they won't be able to tell you necessarily exactly what those exposures are. That's part of what being the X-ray tech is being able to know, this exam gives you this much exposure, right?
And then, okay, Okay, and so then the other question is, does anyone keep track of that per patient?
Oh, so interestingly, no. There is no requirement to keep track of patient radiation doses. Now, certain departments may, and patients are encouraged to keep track of their own. So it's the patient who's actually responsible for it. There may be some tracking if there's like radiation therapy, because in radiation therapy we need to know how much we've given you,
Right.
so that we know if we gave you enough to cure your cancer, right? So in certain circumstances, yes, but on the whole, on average, no one's going to keep track of it. Patients are just encouraged to keep track of their exams. What I like to do when I go into an X-ray room with a patient is I just like to say, you're here today for like a chest X-ray, right? Can you tell me the last time you had an X-ray done, right? And then so they encourage them to talk to you about when the last time was. And if patients have no idea, right, what I have in my office are these little cards that basically they can write down their exams and when they happened, right? And I give them one of those, and it'll encourage them to keep track of it. So no one's going to do it for them, unfortunately. Yeah.
Or ever experienced that?
No, yeah, it's rare, but it should happen, especially if patients have no idea. Like yeah, I get an X-ray like every week. I'm like, do you have a record? I know, because what are the patients going to think? What are they thinking is happening?
It's normal.
It's normal, or the office keeps track of it, right? They're going to think the doctors who are ordering these X-rays are keeping track of it. No one is keeping track of it, unless it's something like radiation therapy where we need to track the dose for like a medical reason, right? Otherwise, no one's going to do that. Yeah, so it's a good idea for patients to do that.
In bigger hospital systems, nobody keeps track of it.
No, I did get a chance to work with one brand new, a few years ago, but one brand new system being installed in a hospital, and that one actually tracked the patient's dose, but it wouldn't like automatically add it to the record or anything. It would just after each exposure would go, this was the dose for that exposure. But it doesn't have to. No one's requiring that to happen. Yeah, yep. It's interesting though, right? Because no one's requiring that to happen, but medical radiation accounts for half of your yearly radiation dose. It's just that they're so low that it's just there's no cause and effect, right? With there's no obvious cause and effect,
Well,
right?
It's like the rise in cancer.
Right.
What's it from?
Right.
X-rays.
What could it be, right?
What could it be?
Yeah, so there you go. So yeah, distributed skin exposure just means that, there's an exam, it requires several x-rays. Basically, we sum over all of the entrant skin exposures for all of the images for that procedure, and that's going to represent the total exposure for the procedure. All these exposures listed assume that the patient is of average thickness, and therefore average radiographic technique is used. Okay? When we make a setting, we set what's called technical factors. Okay? Technique, radiographic technique. There are 4 technical factors. Okay? And let me just take a moment to list them for us. So let me erase the board here. So these are 4 things we're going to change with every image that we take. These can be called technical factors, these can be called technical variables, these can be called radiographic factors or radiographic variables. This all means the same thing, okay? But what these are a combination of electrical and physical variables that will change the quantity or the quality of the X-ray beam that we're creating. Every exam has it requests that you use some specific quantity of the X-ray beam, how much X-rays are you making, and how energetic, what is the quality of that beam. Okay, so if this is your first introductory to it, just start to get used to the terminology, and as we do it more and more, it'll start to make a lot more sense. And the first time you get to go into an X-ray room and make an X-ray exposure, you're going to go, oh, okay, it's easy, right? So over here is a control console, and one of the previous instructors decided to draw all over it with Sharpie, but there's a control console here. All of the settings that I'm going to talk about can be made on this console over here, so we can use that in the future for practice. But let me list what the technical factors even are. So the first one is called kilovoltage peak, and it's given as just a 3-letter acronym KVP. Little k, I should probably draw the k, more like a little k. Okay, little k, capital V, lowercase p. Kvp. This controls the X-ray beam energy, okay? In flashlight terminology, because I like to equate things to flashlights, because everyone's seen a flashlight before, this would be what color is the light coming out of your flashlight? As in, you probably know that blue light is stronger than red light, yeah? Well, with X-ray terms, so like, you know, at night, you guys ever put your phones into like night shift mode or whatever that's called? What does it do to the screen? It makes it orangey, right? It takes away the blue and white light colors that hurt your eyes, and more importantly, that tell your brain it's still daytime. When your brain sees blue light, it goes, hey, it's daytime. And guess what your brain doesn't do? It doesn't produce melatonin, I was like losing the word, and it doesn't make you feel sleepy, okay? If you turn off that setting, or turn on the night shift setting, turn off the blue light, your screen gets a little orangish, and your brain gets a signal that the sun has gone down, and it's more likely to make you sleepier. Right? So people that have insomnia, often it is often the case that they use technology late at night, and use screens late at night, okay? One thing we can do is turn our phones into that night shift mode that takes away the blue light. In X-ray terms, the Kvp changes would change the color of the light, but we can't see X-rays, right? So what we think about with Kvp voltage changes is that it changes the penetrating power of the X-ray beam. Okay, so this is associated with penetrating power. Okay, that little C with the line means width. Probably would have been shorter if I just wrote with. Every body part needs a certain energy for the X-ray beam. Like the X-ray beam has to be strong enough to get through that body part. Okay. If I use a low Kvp setting on a body part that requires a high amount of Kvp to actually get the X-ray beam to pass through it, well then you can't make the image. You have to get you have to make the X-ray beam energetic enough so that it can pass all the way through the body, right? X-rays have this property that they can pass through matter, they can pass through tissue, like visible light cannot, but you have to make the X-ray strong enough to actually punch through the tissue, okay? Kilovoltage settings do that for us. Every body part has what's called a minimum necessary Kvp, and there, for example, so the Kvp on your machines range from about 50,000 to 120,000 volts. 50 to 120 Kvp. Kilo, by the way, means 1,000. Volts is energy, so kilovolts. So you set something between there and that. In flashlight terms, it's setting the color of your flashlight. In X-ray terms, it's setting how penetrating the X-ray beam is. Okay. Those of you who have been with me long enough know that there's some more to it than that, but that's roughly the idea. Kvp sets the penetrating power of the X-ray beam, and every body part requires a different Kvp, right? My hand is easier to penetrate with the X-ray beam than my abdomen is, okay? Why? Because my hand is physically smaller, my abdomen is physically larger, thicker, tissue thickness, and the tissues in my abdomen are denser. They're all fluid-filled, blood-filled organs, right? Where my hand is mostly soft tissue and bone, okay? So the minimum penetration power changes depending on the body part, okay? This is one technical factor that we have to change with every exam. The next technical factor, we can refer to it as mass, but it's not mass like M-A-S-S, mass, like massive. This is mass, which is two quantities. Milliamperage, let me actually fix this. Milliamperage, MA, and time, little s. Milliamperage is abbreviated MA, little m big A. Time is abbreviated with a lowercase s, seconds. So when I turn on a flashlight, I turn it on, the flashlight has a brightness, right? And then I turn the flashlight off again, right? The brightness and the total length of time I turned it on for, between those two things, you can figure out how much light came out of the flashlight, how much total light came out of the flashlight, right? You tell me how bright it is, you tell me how long you left it on for, okay? In X-ray terms, tell me how many X-rays you're making and how long the exposure lasts for, okay? I can make a lot of X-rays for a short time, or I can make a few X-rays for a long time, and that number that we get from that is called our mass number. Milliamperage is an electrical factor. It refers to electric current, but what the number actually means is, what it actually affects, is it affects the quantity. The quantity of X-rays produced. And you change that. A thicker body part is going to require more X-rays than a thinner body part. It's kind of obvious, right? Like, the bigger the thing is, the more you need to get through it. And again, in flashlight terms, it's how bright the flashlight is. How many photons of X-ray are coming out of the X-ray machine? How many photons of light are coming out of your flashlight? And then how long did you make the exposure for? Common milliamperage settings are 50 to about 300 MA. Those are the common numbers. If I look over here on this control console, this one allows me to select 50 milliamps, 100, 200, or 300. Okay. And again, it's an electrical unit. We'll get to talk more about it on a later time. But that's one important thing. Time is just time. The mass number, right? Let me come up here. The mass number, you take the milliamperage that you use and multiply it by the time in seconds that you made the exposure for, okay? You don't have to guess either, okay? In every X-ray room, there's something called the technique chart. And when you look up on the technique chart, you say, all right, I want to shoot a chest X-ray, right? Go to chest, and it's going to tell you what milliamperage and what time to use. Or it may just tell you what the total mass number you should use is. For example, if I wanted to get 10 mass as my mass number, the total quantity of X-rays I'm going to make is 10 mass worth of X-rays. If I made a MA setting of 100, and I wanted to get to 10 mass, what would my time setting be?
10 seconds.
Well, not 10 seconds,
1,
because that would be 1,000, right?
So it would be 0.1.
0.1, right?
Did I say that right?
Yeah, 0.1, 0.1. 1/10 of 100 is 10, right? You could do that really easily by just putting an X here, divide by 100, by 100, get rid of that. 1/10 is 1/10, right? So it's easy math to get there, right? But I'm just giving you a simple example. Every exam is going to tell you, here's the mass number that you need to select for that body part. And all you got to do is over on the machine, you've got to tell the machine, right? I'm going to use 100 milliamps for, I know you can't see this, but 1/10 of a second, right? If I'm asked to get 10 mass, I'm going to select 100 milliamps for 1/10 of a second. But I could also cut the milliamp number in half, cut it to 50, and then do what with the time?
Take longer.
Longer time, right? How much longer? If I went from 100 milliamps to 50, and at 100 milliamps, it was 1/10 of a second. 0.2 seconds, right? I go up to 2/10. I know you can't see this, but I go up to 2/10 of a second, right? That also equals 10 mass. Mass is the total quantity of X-rays produced, and you can get the number with multiple different combinations of electrical milliamperage and total time, okay? If mass is mass is mass, that's how I think about it, right? Again, yeah, so I want to get to 10, I can get there with 100 times 0.1, 100 milliamps for the electrical setting and make the exposure last 1/10 of a second, or I can cut the electrical setting in half and double the time, okay? Right now, we don't have to talk about which one's better, or if there is even a better one, but we just need to know now that there are electrical settings, technical settings, and that's one of them, MAS, M-A-S. These are your two, and really this is sneaky, it's your two main settings, but there's really three here, right? Because this one is two things, electrical factor, milliamperage, and time. The third setting, and I'll just put it over here, it's called SID, and you guys are already exposed to that one. That's the source to image distance. Your source of X-rays, and at a later time we're going to take apart, look into the X-ray tubes, but the source of X-rays is up here in the X-ray tube. X-rays come from the X-ray tube. If they're long enough, no, there's a special spot where it comes from, but the point is, X-rays come from a spot in the X-ray tube, and then they travel downwards through the patient to the image receptor. The distance from the image receptor to the source of X-rays is called source to image distance. Why does that matter? Well, you guys told me earlier why that matters, because radiation, such as light, spreads out as it moves through space. So if you were very close, you would feel a lot of intensity from that. You wouldn't feel anything, but you would get a lot of intensity from that radiation. And if you back up from the source of radiation, the intensity drops, right? Shine a flashlight in your eyes, you go, ow, I back way far away, I shine the same flashlight at your eyes, and it's not as painful anymore, right? It might not even hurt you at all, okay? If I'm far enough away, you might not even see the light, right? Because the light has spread out so much. Okay, so those are what we call technical factors. And there's four of them. Three things are listed, but remember, mass is two different things. There are more than this. These are what are called your four prime factors, okay? Because they're the four most important ones. We'll talk about them a little bit today. I just need to introduce you to them, okay? And last statement is, it should be remembered that listed exposures are partial body exposures, not whole body exposures. Again, 1 gray to the whole body can cause death, but 1 gray to your hand or another part of your body is not going to cause death. It can hurt that part of the body, but it's not going to cause whole organism-wide damage, okay? So let's look at where we compare here, where things compare. Relative risk. I really like these relative risk things. They always make me happy to look at. So let's see if I can zoom in. And it's big enough for everyone to see. Yeah, good. So if you look up at the top brackets are talking about annual natural background stuff, as well as radiation incidents. The annual natural background is about 3 milligray. Add on medical radiography, it's about 6 milligray. That's equivalent in risk. So people have done statistic analysis, risk analysis from X-rays and other things that you can do. It's equivalent in risk to smoking about a pack and a half of cigarettes. So if you are alive and you've lived a year, right, that is the same as smoking a pack of cigarettes, roughly, a pack and a half, 30 cigarettes, right? That is to say, if you smoke a pack and a half of cigarettes, that's a year of extra natural background radiation. Cigarettes are actually radioactive. There is polonium and lead, which are radioactive elements in cigarettes. And here's the gross thing. Polonium and lead are radioactive, and they are a form of radioactive elements called particulate radiation, particle radiation. Particle radiation cannot penetrate through tissue. It can only hit the tissue and deposit into the tissue. So when you inhale cigarette smoke, I don't assume you do, but when someone inhales cigarette smoke, right, they breathe it into their lungs, the lead and polonium stay in their lungs and continue to emit radioactivity forever. They just stay that way, okay? And it doesn't go away, right? That's one reason why cigarettes, that's probably the main reason why cigarettes can cause lung cancer. That's the carcinogenic stuff. There's something like several hundred carcinogens in cigarettes. Those are like some of the two main ones, these radioactive elements. So yeah, cigarettes are harmful. But look at annual natural background of 3 milligray is equivalent in risk to driving 96 kilometers, right? I'm not going to make the conversion to miles right now, but 96 kilometers, okay? Take a look at the worst radiation incidents that we've ever had, okay? One of them was Chernobyl, right, the mid 80s, but one of the worst one by far were the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombings of 1945, okay, the ones that ended the Second World War. The survivors from that were exposed to 2 gray or more to their whole bodies, okay? Remember, 1 gray can cause death. That's equivalent in risk to smoking 16,000 cigarettes, or driving 64,000 miles, or living 700 years of natural, and getting 700 years of natural background. So in one exposure incident, these people received 700 years, more than 7 lifetimes of natural background exposure, okay? This is why the rates of things like childhood leukemia are very high in the survivors, and other types of cancers are very high with them because of that. And again, it's not just the initial explosion. The initial explosion, which is horrible, vaporized like 100,000 or more people, just gone, right? Gone. But it's the ones who survived and who survived the blast but were still exposed to high amounts of radiation and then continued to propagate and make more children. Those are the ones who are having the real, the bad out. The people that are gone are just gone, right? That's terrible. But continuing on, you get this continual spread of genetic damage through their population, and that's not going to go away like anytime soon, right? It takes many generations for genetic defects to sort of work their way out of the gene pool, right? So it's terrible. But that's the worst one. Take a look at the middle. So you're still on the top. Take a look at the middle. Transoceanic jet flight. Okay. Did you guys know that you get radiation exposure on an airplane? But so that's maybe obvious because you get radiation exposure here on the ground. You get more when you're on an airplane. Why? Because you're 35,000 feet in the air. You're almost above our atmosphere. You're not above, but you are high up in our atmosphere. Okay, the air is thinner. There is less atmosphere on top of you to filter out cosmic radiation. And what's protecting you? The tiny little, couple millimeter thick skin of aluminum that airplane's made of, right? So airline pilots and not stewardesses, but whatever, the people who help on the airplanes. Flight attendants? Flight attendants? Thank you. Flight attendants, right? They get more radiation exposure. Their annual natural background exposure is higher because they spend a lot of time. They spend, their entire occupational time, a good chunk of it, 35,000 feet in the air, right? For hours every day. And so a transoceanic jet flight exposes you to 50 microgray in exposure. It's roughly... you do that a couple of times. Let's say you're a flight attendant and you fly across the country a couple of times, maybe in a day, if you can if that's something that can happen. You can get close to, in one day, as a transoceanic flight attendant, right, to what somebody would get in a single chest X-ray. Okay, the point is you're getting exposure up in the plane more than you would down on the ground. It's equivalent to 6 days. Every transoceanic jet flight, which takes hours, right? It's equivalent to days, roughly a week of natural background, okay? Because you're higher up, more radiation higher up, less on top of you. It's not an exact conversion, but when people get things like a chest X-ray, I like to, who are worried about it, I like to ask them, like, have you ever been on an airplane? Like, yeah. I'm like, you got radiation on that airplane. I said, and I like to remind them, like, it's not exactly equivalent, but it's close enough to say these two things have some equivalence to each other, right? Hopping on that airplane was similar in risk, even worse because you have the risk of like crashing the airplane, right? No one's going to crash the office that you're in, right? But similar in risk to hopping on the airplane that are the X-ray exams that we do are. So, it's important to provide some context and perspective for people, right? Because you'll get people who are just terrified. They want to take every apron in your office and just like start layering it on top of them, right? And like hide under it while you do the X-rays. My favorite, which is, and it's just, there people want to protect those. My favorite thing that patients will do is when they get an X-ray, they turn their heads. It makes no difference, right? But so you give patients some perspective, give them some understanding, because without that, we're just in fear, right? We're in fear of radiation. So our Our job is to have a healthy understanding of it and be able to relay that healthy understanding to our patients to, to do things like minimize their fear and increase their understanding of what we're working with. Okay, let's look at some x-ray exams here. So the one-view chest x-ray is one of the lowest level exams, 200 microgray. But if you look over on the all the way right column of that one-view chest x-ray, right, it's equivalent to 3 weeks of natural background. So a physician has to decide, like, do I want to give this person extra radiation equivalent to 3 extra weeks of natural background just to get this little bit of information? And if the risk of not doing it is high, like maybe they develop severe pneumonia, or maybe we don't catch, if they've got a collapsing lung or something terrible, right? If the risk is high, right, or rather if the benefit is high and the risk is relatively low, then we go ahead and we do that exam. Let's look at some of the higher level exams. This is one of the higher level ones. It's not high on here, but one of the higher level ones that you'll do. 5-view C-spine, 5 milligray, okay? That is about 1/10 of the yearly allowance for an x-ray tech. So 5 milligray was 1/10 of the yearly allowance that you are allowed to have as an x-ray tech. And you're giving somebody with 5 milligray for a single, so C-spine is cervical spine, your neck, 5 views of the neck. That's giving somebody 1.7 years of natural background. So you're adding on, roughly speaking, 1.5 years of natural background to their life just by doing that one exam. And if you have to repeat, right, you can figure out, 5-view C-spine, 5 milligray, roughly 1 milligray per image. The neck is a round thing, so the side view, not much more than the front view, as far as exposure. So every time you add on a repeat exposure, you're increasing their exposure level, and you're increasing the equivalent in things like natural background, or kilometers driven, or cigarette smoked, in equivalent risk. You're increasing those numbers. Let's see. Let's go down to one of these high-level ones. Angiogram. So angiography is blood vessel imaging, and it requires high levels of radiation and very detail-oriented x-ray machines. You actually have special x-ray machines that do this. With 5 minutes of fluoroscopy. 5 minutes of fluoroscopy is sort of like the unofficial maximum time that we want to spend. We have to, as a radiographer, I would have to alert the radiologist once they hit the 5-minute mark, okay? So when in fluoroscopy, you have a pedal on the floor, and you can't see, there's no pedal down here. You have a pedal on the floor, right? And every time you push down on that pedal, it starts the x-ray, right? And you see video, you see live feed video of what you're doing, and every time you let off the pedal, it stops, just freeze frames the last image that it took, okay? And every time you press that pedal down, the computer starts the timer. So it's a cumulative timer, it keeps running every time the pedal gets pressed down. With 5 minutes of fluoro time, and many overhead or spot films, we'll take single film images plus the fluoro time that we do, you can get somebody up to about 200 milligray, which, take a look, is equivalent to, roughly a lifetime of natural background, okay? Just in that one exam. 1,600 cigarettes smoked, that's a lot of packs of cigarettes, right, that they could have smoked instead of, having that x-ray done. Probably the x-ray is more beneficial for them though, right? But so this gives you a sort of flavor for, how exposure levels increase per exam. They're relatively low. I mean, these are all the types of exams that we work with. These all down here, these are all radiographer stuff that you won't necessarily be working with until you advance to the higher levels after you graduate. But these types of exams we're working with all the time, okay? And there's an association here. You're giving, the highest level one, 3-view L-spine 50 milligray. That's the yearly allowance for radiographers, right? So it's not an insignificant amount, and that's 17 years of natural background, okay? So they give you those equivalent comparative risks to try and drive home the fact that, you're giving them something substantial, right? It's nothing that's going to cause immediate somatic damage, but it can cause a long-term thing like increase their chance of cancer. It can cause genetic effects, effects to their offspring if the damage happens at the right time in the gonad cell's life if the exposure happens at the right time. So we worry about that stuff. So we want to know, how we can optimize our radiographic technique to keep the doses to our patients as low as reasonably achievable. And we can do some things to lower doses per exam. Yeah.
So, if I'm doing x-rays and I'm wearing my little badge to count up how much exposure I have in a year.
Yeah.
But I also have to get L-spine x-ray
Yep.
done for myself.
Yep.
Would I want to consider wearing my badge while I'm doing
No,
it? It's still exposure.
because the badge is counting occupational exposure, and your L-spine exam is your background. And we have to subtract natural background. So natural background, that's a really good question, because both are radiation exposure, both to you, right? But what matters is separating background exposure from your occupational exposure, right? We just, basically what we say is, you just have to accept the natural background exposure as being there. That's part of why we don't track it, right? Because it's just there, right? And we want to track your occupational exposure. Yeah, that's a really good question. No one's really asked that before, but yeah, that's the reason why. Yep. Okay, great. I'm getting lots of good questions today. This is a good day for us. Okay, so we want to talk about optimizing radiographic technique, right? So the idea is, remember KVP, kilovoltage, affects the X-ray beam and its penetrating power, okay? More penetration for the X-ray beam can be a good thing. KVPs that are too high can affect the images negatively. So it's not only the patient we have to worry about. This whole module is radiation safety, but we also have to be, good radiographers and make X-ray images, right? So the idea here is that a high KVP and low mass technique is generally recommended, as opposed to the opposite of that, which is low KVP and high mass technique. Okay. Now, the reason why they even bother with this, so why you ask do they bother with this? Lots of X-ray techs still working now were trained on film radiography. Okay. Film was the standard until digital radiography came about, and digital radiography has slowly taken over, okay? Well, with film radiography, you didn't have a computer, obviously, right? So every image quality you wanted to demonstrate needed to come from your technical factor settings, okay? If I wanted the image to be darker or lighter, I had to do that by using more or less X-rays, or having a more or less energetic X-ray beam, right? If I wanted an image to be high contrast, very few shades of gray, or if I wanted an image to be low contrast, demonstrate many shades of gray, I would get the many shades of gray low contrast by making a high KVP setting, okay? And the very few shades of gray high contrast by making a low KVP setting. So in the past, we would change these technical factors to directly affect the image qualities. Nowadays with digital, all we need to do is get the information to the image receptor and then let the computer work it out, okay? The way you get the information to the image receptor is you pass the X-ray beam through the patient, right? So high KVP gets more of the X-ray beam to pass through the patient and get to the image receptor, okay? So that's not erasable at all. So you've got, this is how we draw an X-ray tube, just a simple little drawing here, right? X-rays come from up in here and they travel down towards the patient, okay? So you have a patient, right? There's a patient thickness, maybe you've got a head and like a nose, okay? X-rays travel through the patient, and then underneath the patient is the thing called the image receptor, or IR, okay? I should have not drawn that so close, dang it. So, but underneath the patient, there's a thing called the image receptor, IR, okay? The X-ray beam, from where it originates, all the way to the surface of the skin, okay? We call that the primary beam. We say that the primary beam carries strictly no information because it's just the X-ray beam. It's like turning on a flashlight, knowing what kind of information's in that flashlight, right? Nothing, it's just a flashlight, okay? This is just an X-ray beam. Now, the X-rays hit the patient, okay? They touch some piece of anatomy, and then they continue on to the image receptor and strike the image receptor, okay? Some X-rays come down, interact with the patient, and then scatter in some random direction and never hit the image receptor, okay? And some X-rays just go right through the patient without ever interacting with the patient's body and strike the image receptor, okay? The X-ray beam that exits the patient and then makes its way to the image receptor, we refer to that as the remnant, and I'm getting way down here in the whiteboard, the remnant beam, the leftover stuff, okay? The remnant beam carries in it, if you could stop the remnant beam and ask it something, it has all of the information about that patient. How do you know that? Because it just made an image on your image receptor, okay? The X-ray beam carries all of the image signal, okay? With a low kilovoltage setting, I have less of the X-ray beam penetrating the body. Remember, kilovoltage is associated with penetrating power, right? With a low kilovoltage setting, I have lower penetration and therefore less information in the remnant beam, okay, the leftover stuff. The goal of X-ray tech working with a digital system is to use a high enough Kvp that you get sufficient information to the image receptor so that the image receptor can give that information to the computer and build an image from that. So high Kvp and low mass technique lower patient exposure relative to a low Kvp and high mass technique that would carry the same amount of information, okay? So say we want to reduce, let's say we want to get more information to the image receptor, okay? If the image receptor does not have enough information, we would say that the image receptor demonstrates model. Model is a technical word that just means graininess, okay? So think of a grainy picture, you think of the old antenna TVs, right? You get bad image signal when the antennas are not in the right position, right? You get a bunch of, the black and white ant fight, the black and white screen. That's what they called them. That's what I called it. You get that scratchy screen, right, with that bad image signal, right? Maybe you got the antennas in like an okay position, and you got some information, right, but not a lot, right? In X-ray terms, we would call that model. You don't have a good image because you didn't get enough information to the image receptor. The image is very grainy, okay? Sort of like trying to take a picture with your camera at night when you don't have like a good nighttime mode type of camera, okay? Not a lot of information there. If it's nighttime and you're taking a picture with your camera and you get a grainy image, how do you get a better image? More light, right? Turn the lights up, right? In this idea, we would turn the light up, right? We're making the light. It's coming out of our X-ray machine, right? So we could increase the amount of light that we're making, increase the number of X-rays that we create. What factor changed the number of X-rays created? The quantity.
What was the question?
What factor, what electrical factor, what technical factor changes the quantity of X-rays created? Mass, right? So if you had a grainy image and you wanted to increase the image quality by adding more information, you could just raise the mass. You could make more X-rays, okay? Here's the problem. Mass is directly proportional to patient exposure. That is to say, if I double mass, I double the patient's entrance skin dose. The ESD. Direct relationship. Double one, the other doubles. Okay? However, if I instead of raising mass, just make the X-ray beam that I already have more penetrating, that means more of it will get through the patient, right? So I can instead increase KVP. A 15% increase in KVP to the image receptor is the same thing as if you had doubled the mass. But to the patient, they get the benefit. So to them, ignoring all this other stuff, the patient's increase in dose is only about a 30-ish% increase in dose, okay, when you change KVP instead of changing mass. So you want to get an image that's better, right? You can do it by raising mass, which increases patient dose, or you can raise KVP, which also increases patient dose, but way less, okay? 15% increase in KV is equivalent to about a 30, I've heard 40% too, but about a 30% in mass, in exposure increase. Importantly, the image receptor sees both of those as the same thing, yeah.
So if you increase the mass, you're also increasing the time.
You can increase the mass without increasing the time, because you can just increase the milliamperage. So if let's say I wanted to make 10 mass, right? I can, and I was at 100 milliamps for a tenth of a second, the example we gave earlier, right? If I wanted to increase my mass without increasing time, I would go to 200 milliamps and leave the time at a tenth of a second.
But then the exposure to the source is longer. Yes.
The exposure time won't change.
I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
Why KVP is better.
Because it increases the penetration of the beam. More of the beam makes it through the body, less of it absorbs in the body. That's the idea. Yeah. Good. You guys, I gotta run to the financial aid office for just a second. I just got a message from them. Give me just a quick second. I'll be right back. Take about a minute or two, and I'll be right back.
Shoot you up with X-rays.
It'll make more sense once you do like the labs, like actually should be for the MA, for the MAS.
I'm just thinking, how many times did I have a C-spine X-ray?
Oh, okay. You did.
I had a so I did it.
Is it diffusion on the on your
C4 to C6?
Oh no way!
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Do you have images
A what?
of your cervical?
I do.
You do? Oh man, you should bring him so you can see him.
It'll be.
Yeah, he likes to see those type of stuff.
Oh, great. Like which ones? I had multiple. I had that thing done like. Because they were like probably 3 times, and I had a CT and an MRI. So, yeah.
Dang, okay.
I'm over my limit. I can't even.
I can't even shoot him now.
I can't even shoot the pictures now. Oh, that was last year. So,
Yeah, but you know, it's definitely gonna make sense once you shoot one. Only because, like you said, you know, MA and seconds are 2 different things. So you just have to put them together.
Oh yeah. I'm kidding.
It always takes a while.
Well, and, you know, and then the light bulb goes off. I'm like, I just thought you went in the back room and pushed the button. Now you
Yeah,
guys
you
are
think,
turning
right?
knobs and where's your math is off? 0.75.
Yeah, you'll run into that.
You're learning like it's a lot more technical here because you have to learn a lot more.
Sorry about that.
To piece it all together. But when you get to like your site, a bunch of it's already like pre-done on like a computer, so you just push some settings and that's it. But here you have to learn the basics of
Making up numbers.
I remember as a student being so worried about setting radiographic technique, then because I learned it, of course, here like you guys will, right, on our machine, which if you use it, you know it's different than what's out there. It's 100 years old, and it's like that for a good reason, right? So that you learn the individual components, and then you go out there, you're like, oh, it's so easy, right? I worried so much about technique as a student, and then I got out there and I'm like, all right, just plug the number right into the thingy, little LED control, panel, and for the most part, the numbers are given to you on the technique chart in the room, right? You have to learn how to modify them, and you definitely have to learn what they mean, right? So that when you do change them, you know what's going to happen to the image and the patient, right? But yeah, so if it worries you, don't let it. Okay, it will worry you as a student because you have to learn these individual little technical things, but it's not as big of a deal as it might sound, right? So students who are taking x-rays right now, what's the most important thing that you're learning? Yeah. Did you say it? Say it louder so everyone can hear it. Positioning. It's positioning. It's learning how to position the patients, right? How to do the exams, actually position for the exams. Setting technique is a part of it. Learning all this theory is a part of it. But it's the part of it that just sort of sits in your mind, right? So that in the back of your head, you're always going, all right, when I do this, this happens, right? Actually changing the settings is actually pretty easy. Okay, so that's important to not let it worry you so much, because no one told me that as a student, and it worried me a lot, right? I really worried about that. Yeah, worry about the test, but yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to focus too much. I'm pretty much just going to say what it says here and not expand too much. But okay, so the X-ray machine is an electrical device. Okay, it has to generate electricity in order to make X-rays. Okay. So where do we get electricity from? Like not like philosophically, where do we get electricity from? Like literally, where do we get electricity from in a building? We go to outlets and we plug in, right? And that electricity comes from the power lines, right? And the power lines have to send that electricity along their lines, so not wirelessly, along lines from a power plant, nuclear or coal-fired or water generated, whatever it is, right? The way they send it through those lines is by making the voltage really, really high. So now what I haven't told you about voltage for electricity is what pushes the electricity through the lines. The higher the voltage, the bigger the push, okay? So in order to send electricity over miles and miles through those lines, they have extremely high voltages, thousands of volts in those lines, right? But when you plug into your wall with your little phone charger, your computer charger, whatever it is, right? Even your electric dryers at home, you're accessing either 110 volts or 220 volts, depending on which outlets you plug into. Your electric dryer plugs into a 220 volt. You guys ever seen those plugs? They're bigger, right? And they look kind of goofy, right? The plugs are like angled. You definitely can't plug a 220 into a 110 outlet, right? They're purposefully designed like that. But 110 volts is what you get to plug into here at the wall. Most X-ray machines plug into a 220 outlet to get their power. They have to take that 220 volts and then they have to turn it into 50 to 120,000 volts, because that's our Kvp setting, 50 to 120,000 volts, 50 to 120 Kvp, okay? So you're just getting electricity from the wall, and you're modifying it. The thing that modifies the electricity, that changes the voltage for the electricity, is called the generator, okay? Generators, the more efficient ones can make X-rays more efficiently than the less efficient ones, okay? So the same setting on a low efficiency generator versus a high efficiency generator, the high efficiency generator would use less radiation for the patient, would give the patient less actual radiation while still producing a usable image. And that's about all you need to know right now about generators, okay? Because there's a whole conversation about generators to be had. So we could say things like high-powered generators bring a net savings in patient exposure for equivalent techniques. Here at the school, we have an older generator. It's what's called a single-phase generator. And compared to a high-frequency generator, this thing will put out only about a third of the amount of power that a high-frequency generator would. A high-frequency generator would mean is that I could use about a third the amount of radiation on a high-frequency generator. Okay, so they're better for your patients. They're also more expensive too, but and that's not why we have a single phase. We've just had a single phase since like 1990, so it's just the one we've always had, and it works. Importantly, okay, good. So patient exposure could be significantly reduced for mobile procedures by using units that focus on high efficiency generators, charge capacitor generators. They basically work like a battery, okay? Good, so that's important. Filtration in your X-ray tubes, okay? So, where's my thing? It's over here. Keep it in here so I don't lose it. this is an X-ray tube. So an X-ray tube, which some of you haven't seen yet, an X-ray tube is a glass tube. It's honestly kind of like a light bulb, but not exactly, okay? And the light that it makes is X-rays, and you can't see them, okay? When it produces X-rays, the X-rays come out. So all of this is really heavy if you can't tell, I'm struggling to pick this up, but this is all lead and oil that surrounds this glass tube inside of here, okay? All this lead and oil is to shield so the X-rays don't come out from all these other directions, because X-rays go out everywhere, okay, once they're made in the source, where they are made inside of here. But they come out through that opening, okay? That opening is just a glass window, right? We need to be able to adjust the beam intensity on the low end. Basically, we need to be able to absorb the low energy X-rays that don't pass through the patient, that don't have enough energy to pass through the patient, okay? So I like to use the analogy of like a cloudy day, right? If you go outside on a very bright sunny day and spend an hour or two in the sun, you may get sunburn, right? But if you go outside, you go, it's overcast outside. So you go outside on a bright sunny day, you probably put sunscreen on, right? But if you go outside on an overcast day, you look up, I don't see the sun, right? I'm not going to put sunscreen on today, right? You spend that hour or two in the sun, and all of a sudden you get sunburned, right? Why'd you get sunburned? It was overcast and cloudy, right? Well, you got sunburned because the low energy visible light was blocked by the clouds, but the high energy ultraviolet light is not blocked by the clouds. So you've taken the sun, the energy from the sun, and you've taken away all the low energy stuff that you would see, that's all the pretty yellow light from the sun, right? That's all gone. But all of the high energy stuff that you cannot see passes right through those clouds, and that's the stuff that burns your skin. So an overcast day, you can actually get more sunburned than a nice bright sunny day, okay? Partially because you're more conscious of the fact that on a nice bright sunny day, there's the sun, right? So this thing is an aluminum filter, okay, a little slab of aluminum, okay? This sits right in that window, okay? And the people that build these machines, they can figure out how thick this slab of aluminum has to be in order to remove the low energy X-rays coming out of here that are useless to us. They can't pass through the patient, so they only contribute to patient dose. So why even let them out, right? So this is a little slab of aluminum, okay? It's usually about a millimeter thick or so, millimeter and a half. And its job is to absorb, like the clouds do on a overcast day, to absorb the low energy X-rays coming out of here so that they don't make it to the patient. Takes away from patient dose, lowers patient dose. That's filtration. X-ray machines, and this is what's kind of interesting, as X-ray machines age, they increase in their power, okay? They don't actually get weaker over time. The X-ray beam actually gets stronger over time. And for different reasons I'm not going to talk about today, but the X-ray beam actually gets stronger over time. It has to do with changes to the actual glass and the metal inside of the machine. It gets stronger. So over time, your X-ray beam gets stronger, and your filter might have to be changed out to be thicker as your X-ray tube ages to filter out more and more and more of the X-rays that we don't need that are just going to hurt the patient, okay? And so this filtration. So when they say filtration as a way to lower patient dose, this is what they mean, okay? Then they're not always a little coin like this. Some of them are big slabs of aluminum that go in and out of the machine. Some of them actually are placed in the collimator box just between the X-ray tube and collimator. Some of them sit down lower in the box, but importantly, there is a filter that someone designed on purpose and put into your machine, okay? This is an example of one of them. Filter should never be removed. Okay, that one's out because the whole thing's taken apart and we're not using it anymore. But filters should never be removed. If they are removed, the machine should never be used without the filter in it. Okay, that just increases patient dose. The next thing you can do to help decrease patient dose is to limit your radiation field size, right? Physically make your radiation field size smaller. The inclusion of nearby organs in the primary beam makes 100-fold difference in dose to those nearby organs. That is to say, the area outside of the light field that's being irradiated receives about 100 times less radiation than the area inside the radiation field. That's a big difference, right? 100 times different. So every little piece of anatomy you can avoid X-raying is dose saved to your patient. We call this setting the radiation field size. You guys played with those little knobbies, right? That box, that's called a collimator box, and we refer to it as collimation. Okay, collimating is an effective way of reducing patient exposure. Thicker body parts, so patient status, patient habitus, their shape and size. Thicker body parts require higher exposures, okay? So, when at all possible, ask your patients to be thin. No, I'm kidding. No, but what you can actually do is, in certain circumstances, we can use compression, and this is really only done during fluoroscopy. They'll actually take it's literally like a big paddle with a hole in the middle, and they'll use it to push down and compress a tissue to actually physically make it thinner. It's not commonly done. It's done under certain circumstances. We use it too when we need to like move gas around in the body during an image, like when we're doing like gastrointestinal imaging. But yeah, so that can matter. But importantly, the thicker your patient, the higher the exposure. Here's what's interesting. For every 4 centimeter increase in patient thickness, this is a rule called the 4 centimeter rule. For every 4 centimeter increase in patient thickness, their technique that you use has to double. The technique you use has to double. So if I had a patient who was 10 centimeters thick and I had to use 10 mass on them, okay, quantity of x-rays, 10 mass, okay, I have the next patient who's 14 centimeters thick, 4 centimeters thicker. I don't just use a little more mass, I double the mass. A 10 centimeter thick patient might get 10 mass. A 14 centimeter thick patient, will end up getting about 20 mass. Double. Yeah.
So, thinking about that now, again, you made the comparison of, say, your hand to the abdominal
Sure.
area. Would you still increase the mass when you're doing hand, forearm, or say a smaller body part compared to the abdominal area, or would you just try to consider that rule more for the thicker?
Every body part. Yeah, so if I measure you at 4 centimeters here and 6 centimeters here, right? You get 5 mass here, you're getting 7.5 mass up here, right? Every 4 centimeters. The reason is because every 4 centimeter of tissue on average cuts, as x-rays pass through 4 centimeters, so count 1,000 x-rays starting at the surface of a tissue. As it's passed through 4 centimeters, you're now down to 500 x-rays left. Okay, so for every 4 centimeters passing, the x-ray beam is attenuated by 50%, cut in half, right? So you've got to increase the total number to begin with in order to get it through a thicker patient, okay? Patient status matters. Grids and image receptors. I'm not going to talk much about grids right now, but here's what you need to know about grids. They make the images better by catching and eliminating off-focus scattered radiation. So I gave you the example of one X-ray photon coming down here, hitting the patient, scattering in some random direction, right? Never making it to the image receptor, right? But what if instead that photon that scattered, but it went way over here, right? That's a photon that has hit the image receptor, but not underneath the body part that it was supposed to represent. So it's not going to represent the anatomy it should have, so it's going to just be noise on the image receptor. It's scattered radiation, and we don't want it, okay? We don't want that scattered off-focus radiation to hit the image receptor, so we stop it from getting there, okay? The device to do that is called a grid, and in this section I'm not going to explain much about what grids are. If you haven't heard of them yet, it's just fine. But they're a device that can be used to clean up scattered radiation and improve image quality. Your image receptors, your cassettes, right? Inside of the cassette, the hard cassette, there's a piece of film or imaging plate, right? And that plate is what's going to catch, you're fine, and that plate is what's going to catch the image, okay? That means the x-rays have to travel through the front face of the cassette first, right? And you would like it if the front face of your cassette didn't absorb any of the x-rays, okay? So cassettes are made of radiolucent materials, okay? Materials with a very, very low atomic number, made of something very light that doesn't get in the way of the x-rays. One very strong and very light material we know about is carbon. Okay, so we make the cassette fronts typically out of carbon fiber. Okay, and then this tabletop, right? This is an X-ray table. Underneath this table is a tray with an X-ray cassette, right? You could have an X-ray machine up here, and those X-rays would pass through the patient, through the table surface, and then hit this cassette. Okay, we want the cassette to not, the front face of this cassette to not absorb X-rays. Okay, that way the X-rays can get to. Pause for dramatic effect. That way the X-rays can get inside here, where the piece of paper, film, would be. Okay, or the image plate, the actual thing that catches the X-rays, is going to be housed inside of here and closed up. This is an old film cassette, so a piece of film would have gone in here. But we don't want this front cover to get in the way. Okay, we don't want this tabletop to get in the way. So it's made out of wood, but it's made out of a very dry and very light, not very dense wood. Okay, with a tiny cover on the top, tiny thin sheet of this kind of hard stuff on the top here to keep that from happening. But so we have all of these mechanisms to increase the efficiency of the whole system so we can keep patient exposure levels low. Yeah.
Does the cassette have a lifetime?
Yeah. The cassette jacket, not so much. The cassette's jacket lifetime is basically if any of the mechanical pieces fail, right? The locks fail, things like that, the hinges, right? But otherwise, no. The imaging plates that you have inside of the cassettes, they have about a 3,000 to 5,000 image lifetime. So, roughly they last for a year or two, depending on how many images you're making, and like if it's your only one or not, right? That's why we typically have several of them. But yeah, they have a usable life.
So you know how that's an IR, right?
Mm-hmm.
How about the DRs? Do they have a lifetime?
DRs have a usable life too, and they're more expensive when they start to break down. Yeah, to use the technical terms, the deck cells on the DR cassette will die over time, and it's like if I lose pixels on my TV screen, right? I can't just go in and have somebody fix those pixels, right? If I lose the deck cells on the DR cassette, then I have to replace the cassette. Yeah. Now, what's cool is when an individual deck cell, sorry for people who don't know about this, but when the individual deck cells die, computer software can come in and go, there's a dead deck cell there. Let's just take the value for all the deck cells around it and add it to that one. And so on the screen, you wouldn't actually see it. So until the problem gets severe enough to there's many, many, many dead pixels and dead deck cells and things like that, you don't actually notice the problem. And so the software can sort of fix some of it, but not all of it. Yeah.
No, because sometimes on our digital, the screen comes, or like the image comes with like lines on it.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know if it's the cassette itself or if
That
it's
is it DR, or do you actually have it's DR? So it is an effect. What I think you're describing is an effect called the Moire effect, MOIRE, and basically it's a problem with how the computer is scanning the deck cells, and it's scanning them in a way that doesn't match up with what it thinks it's doing, right? And so it gets you these sort of weird lines. Yeah. So it's a totally a software error though. Yeah. What's nice is, when you have a system like that, you want to make sure you have like really good service agreements, right? Whatever you can, warranty stuff to make sure that, when that happens, you're not footing the bill out of pocket, right? Because it can be $100,000 to replace a DR plate, right? They're like a car, like a nice car, Good. Okay.
So,
Yes, please.
Technical question.
Yeah.
So the film inside is reused.
In a film cassette, the film is single use. The film is what you would put up on the view box, right?
Okay.
In a digital cassette, the thing that it, yeah, so in digital cassettes, the thing that's equivalent to film is reused thousands of times. Yeah, yep. And then there are ones that don't have anything inside of them. They're just like computer chips inside of them. Those can be reused thousands of times too. Yeah. But film radiography, single use for the piece of film, digital, thousands of times reused. Definitely, yeah. Okay, let's see. A couple other things. I'm not going to discuss this very much, digital processing speed class, but if you've taken film photography, you might have an idea what I mean when I say speed. Basically, it is a higher film speed will achieve its image exposure sooner, but with less detail. A lower speed film would give you better detail, but it would take longer to make the exposure. This is true of like literally photography, but also true of radiography too, okay? Higher speeds give you you can shorten exposure times and lower patient dose, but you get less detail, okay? So in digital, we would like the highest speed class which does not present an unacceptable level of modeling. Modeling is graininess, okay, lower detail, okay? And some procedures would allow for that, like the ones where we just don't need a ton of detail, right? So there we go, speed class. Radiographic positioning. This is the biggest problem. Okay, this is the biggest way we can fix patient dose. Okay, repeat exposures for minor positioning corrections must be discouraged. We only repeat the exposure if it is mis or malpositioned enough to require repeat. Basically, simply speaking, if the positioning error is big enough to where the physician would lose diagnostic information. Okay, remember that's what you're doing, right? You're making an X-ray image, radiograph, so the physician can use it for diagnosis. If your error is big enough to where they would lose information and it would affect their diagnosis, then you repeat the image. You don't repeat it because it didn't look pretty or something like that, right? It didn't have exactly the qualities you're looking for. In X-ray techs, we get really, really persnickety about our images, right? That's put up on a screen for everyone to see. That's mine. It's even got my my left-right marker on it, right? That's mine, okay? And I don't want to turn in something that's bad, right? But you have to remember that every time you fix something to make a new image, right, you're increasing, doubling patient exposure. So we only repeat when we need to. That's where good X-ray techs come in, right? You get it done right the first time. And if it's grossly out of whack, really out of malposition, then you repeat the image when you need to, right? So good X-ray tech knows when to repeat and when to not, and when to just accept that sometimes we make errors, right? And those errors may not require a repeat. It's especially common of students, which is why students are required to, if they need to repeat an X-ray, they have to have the supervising radiographer with them. They can't just go decide when to repeat. And we're always doing that. We're always trying to minimize repeats. Brand new, when you're a licensed radiographer and you're working at an office, you're brand new there. You're more likely to perform more repeats because you're trying to show that I can make good X-rays, right? And so you're not putting up the mistakes that you make, right? You're more likely to make repeats for small errors. We discourage that. Okay. Increasing SID to decrease patient dose. I'm not going to talk about the inverse square law, but simply put, increasing SID reduces patient entrance skin dose somewhat, even after you increase the mass number to compensate for the inverse square law. Just remember, radiation spreads out as you move away from it, right? So if you move away from it and you want to keep exposure levels the same as when you were close, you've got to use more radiation. That's all. That's all the inverse square law says. But it says it in a, complicated, concise, rigorous way. Okay, good. So we don't need to worry about that too much. Good. All right, let's see. Last thing here, okay? Radiographic technique and automatic exposure control, AEC. Who has AEC? Who knows they have AEC? What's your take on it?
Cool. Just push the button and then it stops on its own.
Any problems?
Occasionally, but I'm not really sure exactly what the technicals of the machine is.
That's fine. Any problems that you've directly experienced where you're like, hey, I don't like that about AEC? Anything?
No.
My biggest beef with AEC is that you have to select the ion chambers, right? So you have to basically, so AEC is automatic exposure control, right? And you have in the thing, just above the cassette, you have something called an ion chamber, okay? And you have to tell, there's 3 of them, and they're in different positions, and you have to tell the computer which one you want active. And that ion chamber, like the Geiger counter example I showed you earlier, is sensitive to radiation. When enough radiation hits it, it sends a signal to the X-ray machine, hey, shut off, right? So there's no time that the exposure happens for. The machine shuts it off when the exposure has reached the right level, right? So it's a backup timer, right? So it's great if you get good with positioning. If you select this ion chamber here for a spine, but you put the spine over here, right? then the ion chamber is not going to shut off at the right time, okay? It's going to shut off way too soon, right? So AEC is great as long as you use it right. That's true of any tool, right? Tools are great when you use them correctly, okay? AEC is a tool. Use it correctly and it will benefit you. My other problem with AEC is that it's the same thing, selecting the right ion chamber, but selecting wall versus table. Okay, making sure you select the right one. You can easily forget that you were just working on the wall and go back to work on the table. And you've told the machine, I'm using the wall when you're really using the table. So the whole time you're pointing the X-ray tube at the table, and the wall's going, did you turn it on, right? And it's not gonna shut off, right? And we know, people who work with AEC know that there is such a thing that will shut the machine off after a certain amount of time, but by that point you've grossly overexposed the patient, right?
So for
Yeah.
AEC, do you set the SID and everything? Like, do you move the X-ray tube?
Yeah.
So let's say that you do put it towards the wall, but you're selecting the table. It still thinks that it's the table.
It thinks it's at the table.
So it won't shut off on the wall.
It won't shut off, yeah.
Oh,
Because the ion chambers on the wall are not active. So the whole time the table, when you press the exposure button, the whole time the table is waiting for the exposure, and it never gets it. So it never shuts off the exposure at the right time. It goes to the backup time, which is like some really long time, right? But it goes to that and then stops, right? And so you might give somebody an exam that might need 8 or 10 mass, might get 400 or 600 mass, right? Which you don't need to know exactly what mass means to know that 400 to 600 is a lot more than 10, right? And so, yeah, there are problems with it. But again, as any tool, when used correctly, they work great, okay? It lowers patient exposures when used correctly. And the regular use of technique charts, okay? It is a requirement that every radiographic suite have a technique chart available. I have been to so many facilities to affiliate them with us, where you have X-ray techs who use AEC and do not have technique charts because they think they don't have to, because they go, well, the machine does it for me. I said, well, what if the AEC fails, right? What if what if you have a patient who's 600 pounds and you got to figure out the exposure for them, right? You can't do it with AEC. AEC is not designed for those, extreme situations, right? You've got to be able to set technique. Well, then I'll just set technique. I said, good luck telling the state that when they come in, I just set technique. It can't work like that. You have to go from a technique chart, and you have to set technique from that. They're required, and anyone who says they don't have it, it's there somewhere. They just don't want to go look for it, right? They may not even know they have it, right? But there is one. Every X-ray room has a technique chart. So last thing here, quality control and half value layer. I'm not even going to talk about half value layer because it takes too long. Quality control programs will help detect trends toward poor imaging or excessive patient exposure before these results actually come about, okay? Having regular quality control checks on your equipment will make sure your equipment's working right. Having regular quality assurance procedures to make sure your employees are doing the right thing will make sure the right things are being done. All right, so with that, we've finished everything we need to today. I'm so